Today we are continuing the review of Samin Nosrat's Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. The chapter up for discussion today is Heat, but instead of talking about this chapter on its own, I thought it would be more interesting to compare and contrast Samin Nosrat with Kenji Lopez-Alt. In case you're not familiar with Kenji's work, he is the managing culinary director of SeriousEats.com, where he writes a column called The Food Lab. He also published a book by the same name, but I believe that Kenji is best digested in an article format. So in this video, when I refer to The Food Lab, I am talking about his column and not his book. Heat transforms food in two big ways. It creates flavor through browning and it changes the texture. When it comes to browning, both Samin and Kenji will give you similar advice. Make sure your protein is dry and preheat the pan and use enough oil, don't crowd the pan and all that jazz. That stuff is actually pretty easy. But when it comes to texture, they take very different approaches. Say you're having a hard time figuring out when your steak is done. Samin argues that the problem is your lack of intuition, and she tries very hard to build up that intuition in her book by describing what the steak should feel like when you touch it with your finger, what it should look like, smell like, all the different sensory things you can use to determine the doneness of your steak. Kenji thinks that the problem is not your lack of intuition, the problem is the procedure. Redesign the procedure to be less error-prone, and you'll have a great steak on your first try. Traditional methods don't always need fixing. You can monitor the progress of so many things as they're cooking quite easily, just using your senses. You can always poke a potato with a skewer to see if it's done. You can poke a short rib with a fork and see if the meat fibers pull apart. You can separate the flakes of a fish fillet and peek inside. For these kinds of dishes, Samin's advice of looking, touching, poking, smelling, and tasting is great. She is also absolutely correct that any attempts to quantify heat and time are kind of hopeless. Say a recipe says to cook short ribs for 3 hours in a 300 Fahrenheit oven. You might do that and they might not be done. Your oven is different, your short ribs are different, maybe they're a little bit bigger, maybe they're a little bit tougher. Who knows? Your pan might even be different. So all bets are off when exactly they'll be done. But if they aren't done, when you check them, you can just put them back in the oven and check them again in 20 minutes or so. And if you didn't catch a perfect moment, no worries. Even if you overcook them by like 20 minutes, they'll still be fine. They have a really large window of opportunity where the texture is going to be really nice. But try this touchy-feely approach with a steak and you are in for a disappointment. In the first few years of cooking, I have ruined more steaks than I can count on my fingers. I believe that's because I was firmly planted in this intuitive way of cooking. The kind of cooking that Samin advocates. I could produce the best ossobuco one week and then a dry pork chop the next. Or a wonderful fish dish one day, but an overcooked hard-boiled egg. In fact, my hard-boiled eggs never came out the same way twice. And that's because it is really hard to look inside the shell of an egg, or inside a steak, or inside a rack of lamb, or a pork chop, or a chicken breast. If there was a cooking superhero, her superpower would be X-ray vision. But what if you don't have X-ray vision? Samin suggests the poke test. That's how people judge doneness for hundreds of years. They just touch their meat. Oh, the poke test. It only works if you are cooking something like 50 steaks a day that are perfectly portioned to be the same thickness and the same cut. So yes, if you're a line cook and you're cooking 50 ribeyes a day, and all of those ribeyes are about 1.5 inches. Eventually, you'll develop some intuition about how that ribeye should feel in terms of firmness when it's at medium rare versus medium well, etc. For a home cook, that's completely impractical. I mean, how many of you are going to cook 50 pre-portioned ribeyes every day? Seriously. Some of Samin's suggestions make perfect sense theoretically, but at times they are hard to put into practice. For example, this idea that you should make sure the outside of your ingredient is brown by the time it reaches the right texture inside. You know, if I'm cooking potatoes and they are brown on the outside but not tender enough yet, I might just turn down the heat to let them finish cooking. And if they are pale but very soft, I might crank up the heat to help them brown faster. But trying to optimize these two variables on an ingredient which has a tiny window of opportunity to have that right texture, like a steak, is really, really difficult. Kenji thinks the problem is the procedure. Why not separate these two things, the browning and the doneness? Let's use a low temperature oven to cook the inside of the steak, then use a hot skillet or grill to brown it. When using a 250-degree oven, you can be off by as much as 5 minutes and still produce a wonderful steak. You know, try being off by 5 minutes using traditional methods. I mean, you'll be eating shoe leather. Kenji also suggests using a thermometer to figure out when to switch from the oven to the skillet. It's not idiot-proof, but learning to stick a thermometer into the right spot is way easier than judging the doneness by poking the meat with your finger. I know we love to glorify tradition when it comes to cooking, but I'm not sure why. Would you like to have a surgery performed in a hospital that uses traditional methods from the 19th century? Would you like to buy a car built using the original Ford factory? And what do you think about parenting children using traditional methods? I mean, we've been beating them for most of human history, so why stop now? I doubt I need to give you more examples that sometimes progress is preferable to tradition. You know, in most other fields, we try to reduce human error. We try to design better procedures to make sure we get a more consistent product. So why wouldn't we do that with cooking? You know, all I'm saying is that if I were to give one cook Samin's cookbook and another cook Kenji's Food Lab column and asked both of those cooks to cook me a steak, I would bet my money on the cook with the Food Lab. Of course, if you got Samin and me in the room and let us chat for 15 minutes or so, we might realize that we are in violent agreement. She does suggest that you use a thermometer on roasts and test multiple spots, which I think is very wise. So the question is, at which point does a piece of meat go from being a steak to being a roast? Now, from the culinary perspective, as soon as you can easily insert a thermometer into a piece of meat sideways, you should be using the thermometer and treating this piece of meat as a roast. But from English language perspective, a half-inch thick piece of meat is called a steak, and a 2-inch thick piece of meat is also called a steak. And that's unfortunate because for a really thin steak, Samin's philosophy works great, but for thick steaks, Kenji's reverse sear method works a lot better. I know I made it sound like a battle of the steaks, but I wanted to give you very concrete examples of how Samin and Kenji approach cooking. I think both of them have something very profound to say about heat, and both of them are worth exploring in great detail. But when it comes to ingredients with a short window of opportunity, where texture really matters, I think that Kenji's advice is more actionable and will result in a faster success. I would love to hear your thoughts on Samin's and Kenji's work. Or maybe there was another food writer that was really influential in your life. Who was it? Please let me know in the comments. For more thought-provoking culinary commentary, don't forget to subscribe to Helen's Kitchen channel. And if you are ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes.